Hi, friends. I am Freya. Today, I am going to share my struggle of learning English. Part 1 The Beginning. Hello, I am Freya, and I want to share my story of learning English. It all began when I was 20 years old, living in a small town where no one spoke English. At that time, I didn't know how to speak or understand even a single word of English. To be honest, I didn't think I needed to learn it. I lived my whole life without English and everything seemed fine. But deep inside, I always had a dream to visit London. I had heard so much about London, about the big city, the famous places, and the interesting people. I saw pictures in books and on the internet, and it looked like such an exciting place. But there was one big problem. Everyone in London speaks English, and I didn't know how to say even simple things like hello or thank you in English. One day, I realized that if I ever wanted to visit London, I needed to learn English. I also started thinking that if I knew English, I could find better jobs. I had seen many job ads that needed people who could speak English, and it seemed like the language would open up new opportunities for me. So, at age 20, I made a decision. I was going to learn English, but where would I start? I didn't have a lot of resources, and in my small town, there were no easy ways to learn. There weren't many people around who spoke English, and I didn't know where to begin. I started by looking for classes. After searching for a while, I found a small language school not too far from my home. It wasn't very big, but they offered English classes for beginners. I was so excited to sign up, but at the same time, I felt nervous. What if I couldn't do it? What if I was too old to start learning a new language? All these thoughts ran through my mind, but I pushed them away. I reminded myself of my dream to visit London one day. My first day in the English class was very difficult. I sat with other students, and everyone seemed as lost as I was. The teacher started with the basics, the alphabet. It felt strange to me because I was used to my own language, and the English letters sounded so different. I couldn't even pronounce simple words like cat or dog correctly. I was embarrassed every time I had to speak in front of the class because I made so many mistakes. After the first class, I remember going home and feeling overwhelmed. I thought, how will I ever learn this? English is so hard. I wanted to give up right then. I felt like learning English would be too difficult, and maybe I wasn't smart enough to do it. But I didn't quit. I told myself, Freya, you've made the decision to learn. You can't stop now. So I went back to class the next day. Each day felt like a struggle, but I kept going. My teacher was patient and kind, and that helped. She encouraged me, telling me that learning a language takes time and practice, and it was okay to make mistakes. The more I practiced, the more I began to understand. I learned how to say simple things like good morning and how are you? I still couldn't have a full conversation, but at least I was starting to recognize words. I started to write them down and repeat them to myself at home. During this time, I also tried to teach myself more English by using whatever I could find. I borrowed books from the library and started watching English shows with subtitles. I didn't understand much at first, but I hoped that if I kept watching, I would slowly pick up new words. It was hard, really hard. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't improving at all. But every time I thought about quitting, I reminded myself why I started. I thought about London, about the dream I had to visit that city. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never get there. So I kept going. Even though my progress was slow, I could feel that I was getting better, little by little. I knew it would be a long journey, but I was determined to learn. I wasn't just learning a language, I was chasing my dream. Part 2: The difficulty of learning a new language. In the early days of learning English, things were very difficult for me. Every day felt like a struggle, and I often wondered if I would ever be able to speak English properly. The language seemed strange to me, and no matter how hard I tried, I kept making mistakes. One of the hardest things for me was grammar. English grammar was confusing, and it didn't seem to make any sense. In my language, the rules were different, so I kept mixing things up. I didn't understand why the words in English were put together in such strange ways. Sometimes I couldn't even figure out where to begin. Like it felt like I was lost in a big, confusing maze of words. Another challenge was a pronunciation. The way English words sounded was very different from my own language. Some sounds in English didn't even exist in my native language, so my mouth wasn't used to saying them. When I tried to say words out loud in class, they sounded wrong. I could hear myself making mistakes, but I didn't know how to fix them. It was embarrassing, especially when I tried to speak in front of others. I was afraid people would laugh at me. I remember one time in class, we were practicing saying simple sentences. The teacher asked me to say, "The cat is on the mat." It sounded easy, but when I spoke, my pronunciation was all wrong. I could feel my face getting hot with embarrassment as the other students looked at me. The teacher corrected me, but I still couldn't say it right. After class, I felt so frustrated. I asked myself, why is this so hard? Will I ever be able to speak English? It wasn't just in class that I struggled. Outside of class, I tried to practice, but it didn't always go well. When I went to the market or walked around my town, I tried to say a few English words to myself, but people would sometimes give me strange looks because they didn't know what I was saying. There were very few people around me who spoke English, so I had no one to practice with. I felt alone in my journey, and it seemed like no one understood how hard it was for me. Another thing that made learning English hard was vocabulary. There were so many new words, and I couldn't remember all of them. I would study words one day, and by the next day, I had forgotten half of them. I used flashcards, wrote down words in a notebook, and repeated them out loud. But the words didn't seem to stick. It was like my brain couldn't hold all of the new information. I felt overwhelmed by how much I had to learn. Sometimes I would see or hear a word I had studied before, and I knew I should remember it, but I just couldn't. I felt disappointed in myself, as if I wasn't trying hard enough. I kept asking myself, why can't I remember these words? Am I not smart enough to learn this language? There were days when I felt like giving up completely. The thought of quitting crossed my mind many times. Learning English felt like trying to climb a huge mountain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach the top. I saw other people who could speak English so easily, and I felt like I would never get there. I thought about how easy it would be to stop, to just give up and go back to my normal life without English. But then I would remember my dream of visiting London. I knew that if I gave up, I would never be able to reach that dream. I kept telling myself that learning a new language wasn't supposed to be easy. It would take time, effort, and patience. Even though I felt like I was failing, I knew that I had to keep going. I also remembered something my teacher had told me. Mistakes are a part of learning. Don't be afraid to make them. At first, I didn't understand this. I thought making mistakes meant that I was bad at learning English. But slowly, I started to realize that each mistake I made was teaching me something. Every time I said a word wrong or used the wrong grammar, I learned how to say it correctly the next time. It wasn't easy to accept that I wouldn't learn English quickly. I had to change my way of thinking. Instead of getting upset when I made a mistake, I tried to see it as part of the learning process. I started to believe that even though I was struggling now, I would get better with time. Slowly, I began to see small improvements. I could understand a few more words, and my pronunciation got a little better. Even though the progress was slow, I held on to those small victories. They gave me the hope and motivation to keep moving forward. Part 3. Learning with determination. After facing so many struggles in my early days of learning English, I knew I had two choices. I could give up or I could push through and keep trying. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that giving up wasn't an option. My dream of visiting London was too important, and I had already come too far to stop now. I had to find a way to keep going, no matter how hard it was. One day, I decided that I needed a better plan. Just attending English classes a few times a week wasn't enough. If I really wanted to learn, I had to practice every day. I started to create a routine for myself. Each morning, I would spend at least 1 hour studying English. I would go over the new words we had learned in class and practice saying them out loud. I also started writing simple sentences in a notebook, using the new vocabulary and grammar rules I was learning. At first, it was tough to stay focused. Sometimes I felt tired or didn't feel like studying, but I reminded myself that this was my dream, and if I wanted to succeed, I had to work for it. So, even on the days when I didn't feel motivated, I forced myself to sit down and study. Slowly, it became easier. The more I practiced, the more I began to see small improvements. One thing that really helped me was watching English movies and listening to English music. At first, I couldn't understand anything, but I didn't let that stop me. I watched with subtitles, reading along with the words. Even though I couldn't catch everything they were saying, I would pick out a few words here and there. It felt exciting to recognize a word or phrase that I had learned in class. Music was another big help. I would listen to simple English songs and try to follow the lyrics. Sometimes I would write the words down and look them up in a dictionary to understand what they meant. The rhythm of the music made it easier to remember words, and I found myself singing along to songs even when I didn't fully understand the meaning. But that was okay. I knew that with time, I would learn more. One of the most important things that helped me during this time was finding a good teacher. My teacher saw that I was struggling and gave me extra help. She encouraged me to keep going and reminded me that learning a new language takes time. She never made me feel bad for making mistakes. Instead, she told me that mistakes were a sign that I was learning. My teacher also gave me some advice that changed the way I looked at learning English. She said, "You don't need to be perfect, you just need to keep improving." This simple advice took away some of the pressure I had been feeling. I'd always thought that I needed to speak perfectly, with no mistakes, in order to succeed. But now, I understood that every small improvement was a step in the right direction. I didn't need to be fluent right away. I just needed to keep moving forward. I also started to make English part of my daily life in small ways. When I went to the market, I would try to think of the names of fruits, vegetables, and other items in English. I would say simple sentences to myself, like, "I need to buy apples," or "I am walking to the market." This helped me get used to thinking in English, even when I wasn't in class. Another thing I did was carry flashcards with me everywhere I went. On each card, I wrote a new English word on one side and the translation in my native language on the other side. Whenever I had a few spare minutes, while waiting for a bus or sitting at home, I would pull out my flashcards and go over the words. It became a habit, and it helped me memorize new vocabulary. As time went on, I started to notice small victories. One day, I was watching a movie, and I realized that I could understand an entire sentence without needing to read the subtitles. It was such a small thing, but it made me so happy. It was proof that all my hard work was paying off. Another time, I was practicing speaking with a friend, and I managed to have a short conversation in English without feeling completely lost. It wasn't a perfect conversation. I still made mistakes, but I could understand more than before. These little successes made me feel proud and motivated me to keep going. Of course, the journey wasn't without challenges. There were still days when I felt frustrated and like I wasn't making enough progress. But instead of letting those feelings stop me, I used them to push myself harder. I told myself, "You've already come this far, Freya. Don't give up now." Looking back, I realized that this was the turning point for me. I had gone from feeling like I couldn't learn English to believing that I could. I had developed a routine, found new ways to practice, and learned to be patient with myself. Each day, I was getting better, even if the progress was slow. The most important thing I learned during this time was that determination is key. It wasn't about being perfect or learning quickly. It was about showing up every day, doing the work, and believing in myself. I knew that as long as I stayed focused and determined, I would reach my goal. Part 4. More than just words. As I continued learning English, I started to realize something important. Learning a language is not only about the words, grammar, and pronunciation. It's also about understanding the culture behind the language. I had never thought about this when I first started learning English. I thought that if I could memorize enough words and rules, I would be able to speak fluently. But there was much more to it than that. The first time I noticed this was when I began to have small conversations in English. I could say basic sentences like, "How are you?" or "Where's the bus stop?" But when people answered me, I often felt confused. They didn't just say, "I am fine," or "The bus stop is over there." Instead, they would say things like, "Not too bad," or "It's just around the corner." These phrases were very different from what I had learned in my classes. I didn't understand why they said things that way, and it made me realize that I was missing something important. Another thing that was confusing for me was idiomatic expressions. I remember one time in class, the teacher said, "It's raining cats and dogs." I was shocked. How could it rain cats and dogs? I looked around the room and I saw the other students laughing. I didn't understand the joke. Later, the teacher explained that this was just a common way of saying it was raining heavily. English had many expressions like this that didn't make sense when translated directly, and it was difficult for me to remember all of them. I also struggled with the way native speakers talked. In my English class, we learned to speak slowly and clearly. But when I listened to English speakers in movies, music, or even online videos, they talked so fast. They used words I didn't know, and sometimes they didn't even finish their sentences. It was hard to keep up, and I often felt lost in the conversation. The cultural differences became even clearer when I started learning about politeness in English. In my own language, we have certain ways of showing respect when we speak. I noticed that in English, people were polite in a different way. For example, English speakers say please and thank you a lot. And they often use softer language when asking for something. Instead of saying, "Give me the book," they would say, "Could you please pass me the book?" This was new to me. I had to learn not only how to speak English, but also how to speak it politely in the right context. I began to understand that learning a language means learning a new way of thinking. English speakers have their own ways of expressing themselves that are different from what I was used to. It wasn't just about translating words from my language to English. I had to learn how to think in English, how to express myself in a way that made sense to people who grew up with the language. At first, this was very hard for me. I felt like I was trying to be someone else, like I was putting on a mask when I spoke English. I didn't feel like myself, and that made me uncomfortable. But slowly, I began to see it differently. I realized that I wasn't losing my identity. I was growing. I was becoming someone who could communicate in a new way, someone who could understand and connect with people from different parts of the world. One of the hardest things to understand was humor in English. Jokes and funny expressions in English didn't always make sense to me. People would laugh at things I didn't find funny, and I often felt left out in conversations. For example, I remember watching a comedy show in English with subtitles. The audience was laughing, but I didn't get the joke. I could read the words, but I didn't understand why they were funny. I talked to my teacher about this, and she explained that humor is often based on cultural references. Many jokes come from the way people live, the things they watch on TV, and the experiences they share. If you didn't grow up in that culture, it's hard to understand the joke. This made me realize that learning English wasn't just about language, it was about learning a new culture, too. One thing that helped me was talking to people from different places who spoke English. I started joining online language groups where people from all over the world came together to practice English. These groups helped me not only practice speaking, but also understand how people from different cultures used English. I learned that English could sound very different depending on where the speaker came from. In these groups, I met people from places like the United States, Australia, India, and South Africa. They all spoke English, but their accents, phrases, and ways of speaking were different. At first, it was hard to understand them because they used words and expressions I hadn't learned in class. But as I talked to them more, I started to understand the differences and the similarities in how they spoke. I also learned more about how body language and tone worked in English. For example, in my culture, people don't smile much when they meet someone for the first time. But in English-speaking countries, smiling and making eye contact is an important part of showing friendliness and respect. These small cultural differences were things I had to learn and adapt to, even though they weren't part of the language itself. By learning more about the culture behind the language, I began to feel more comfortable speaking English. I wasn't just learning words and grammar anymore. I was learning how to communicate with people in a way that felt natural to them. This helped me feel more confident, and it made my conversation feel more real and less awkward. As time went on, I realized that learning a new language is really about understanding people. The more I learned about English-speaking cultures, the easier it became to connect with others. It wasn't easy, but every day I grew a little more confident, and I felt like I was becoming part of a bigger, more connected world. Part 5. The Journey to London. 10 years had passed since I first started learning English. I was no longer that young girl, unsure and struggling to say even simple words. I had worked hard, faced many challenges, and learned so much about the language and culture. And now, at the age of 30, it was time to make my dream come true. It was time to visit London. Since the day I started learning English, London had been my goal. It was the city I had always imagined, the place I had heard so much about but had never seen. For years, I had dreamed of walking its streets, seeing its famous landmarks, and, most importantly, speaking English with the people who lived there. I remember the day I booked my ticket. My heart was racing with excitement and a bit of fear. I had saved enough money for the trip, and now it was real. I was actually going to London. As I looked at the confirmation on my computer screen, I couldn't believe it. I had been dreaming of this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. The weeks before the trip was filled with preparation. I booked a place to stay in the heart of the city, made a list of all the places I wanted to visit, and practiced my English as much as I could. Even though I had been learning for 10 years, I was still nervous. This would be the first time I would be surrounded by native English speakers, and I wasn't sure if I was ready. What if I couldn't understand them? What if my English wasn't good enough? But despite my fears, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I had spent years preparing for this, and now it was time to take the next step. I wasn't going to let fear stop me from living my dream. The day of my flight arrived, and as I boarded the plane, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The flight was long, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was full of thoughts about what London would be like, how I would manage, and what it would feel like to finally be in the city I had dreamed of for so many years. When the plane landed at Heathrow Airport, my heart was pounding. As I stepped off the plane and into the busy airport, I heard English being spoken all around me. It was a strange feeling, being surrounded by a language I had worked so hard to learn. I felt excited, but also a little overwhelmed. This was real. I was really in London. Getting through the airport was my first real test. I had to speak to the immigration officer and explain the purpose of my visit. Even though I had practiced what to say, I was still nervous. When it was my turn, I stepped forward and spoke in English. The officer asked me questions about my trip, how long I would stay, where I would be staying, and why I was visiting. At first, it was difficult to keep up with the conversation. The officer spoke quickly, and his accent was different from what I was used to. But I took a deep breath, asked him to repeat some of the questions, and did my best to answer. After a few minutes, he stamped my passport with a smile and said, "Welcome to London." Hearing those words filled me with relief. I had done it. I was officially in London, and I had spoken English. It wasn't perfect, but I had managed, and that was what mattered. As I left the airport and made my way into the city, I couldn't help but smile. The sights of London were even more beautiful than I had imagined. I saw the famous red double-decker buses, the old buildings mixed with modern ones, and the busy streets full of people. I had only seen these things in pictures before, and now they were right in front of me. Over the next few days, I explored the city. I visited Big Ben, the Tower of London, Buckingham Palace, and so many other famous places. I walked along the River Thames and spent time in Hyde Park, enjoying the beautiful gardens and the fresh air. Everywhere I went, I heard people speaking English, and it felt amazing to be able to understand and communicate, even though I still made mistakes. One of the most exciting moments was visiting a local cafe. I had always dreamed of sitting in a small London cafe, ordering a cup of tea and a pastry, just like I had seen in movies. When I walked in, I felt a bit nervous. The cafe was filled with people, all chatting in English, and I wondered if they would notice that I wasn't a native speaker. I stepped up to the counter and, in my best English, ordered a cup of tea and a slice of cake. The woman behind the counter smiled and asked me a few questions about what kind of tea I wanted. Her accent was thick, and I had to ask her to repeat herself a couple of times, but she was kind and patient with me. I left the cafe with my tea, feeling proud of myself. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot to me. One of the biggest challenges I faced was the different accents in London. In my classes, I had learned what is called Standard English. But in London, people spoke with many different accents. Some were easy to understand, but others were much harder. I met people from different parts of the UK, and each person seemed to speak English in a slightly different way. At first, it was confusing, but I realized that this was part of the experience. London was a big, diverse city, and I was learning to adapt. There were also times when I struggled to follow conversations. Some people spoke too quickly, and I had to ask them to slow down or repeat themselves. I felt a bit embarrassed when I didn't understand, but I reminded myself that it was okay to make mistakes. After all, I was still learning, and the important thing was that I was trying. By the end of my trip, I had grown much more comfortable speaking English. I wasn't perfect, but I had come a long way from where I started. Walking through the streets of London, I felt a sense of pride. I had reached the place I had always dreamed of, and I had done it by working hard and never giving up. As I boarded the plane to head back home, I realized that this wasn't the end of my journey. It was just the beginning. London had been my dream, and now that I had reached it, I felt ready for whatever came next. Part 6. Meeting Native Speakers. After arriving in London, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I had spent so many years preparing for this moment, dreaming of visiting the city where English is spoken everywhere. But once I was there, I realized that speaking with native English speakers was a whole new challenge. I had learned English in a classroom for many years, but speaking with people who had spoken the language their whole lives was different. In class, we spoke slowly and carefully, and the teacher always corrected us when we made mistakes. But now, in the real world, people spoke quickly, and they didn't stop to correct me when I didn't understand something. One of the first things I noticed was that native English speakers often use slang and informal phrases. These were not the words I had learned in class. For example, when I went to a small shop, I asked the man at the counter how he was doing. Instead of saying, "I'm fine," like I expected, he said, "Not too bad." This confused me. I had never learned this phrase, and I wasn't sure if it was good or bad. Later, I found out that "not too bad" is just a casual way of saying, "I'm okay." Another thing I quickly realized was that accents in London were very different from the English I had heard in class. I had learned standard English, but in London, people spoke with many different accents. Sometimes I would talk to someone and understand them perfectly, but the next person might speak with a strong local accent, and I would struggle to follow along. It was frustrating at times, but it also made me realize how diverse the English language is. One of the first native English speakers I met was a young woman named Emily. We met at a cafe one morning when I was ordering breakfast. I was sitting alone, and she came up to me and asked if the seat next to me was free. I was a bit nervous, but I said, "Yes, please sit down." She smiled and introduced herself. Emily was friendly and talkative, and I was excited to finally have a real conversation with someone who spoke English as their first language. But as we started talking, I found myself struggling to keep up with her fast speech. She used a lot of casual expressions that I didn't understand, and sometimes I had to ask her to repeat what she said. I remember one moment when she asked, "So, what brings you to London?" I knew she was asking why I had come to the city, but the phrase, "What brings you?" was new to me. I hesitated for a moment before answering, "I've always wanted to visit." Even though I didn't fully understand the question at first, I figured it out by the context. As we continued talking, I made a few mistakes. At one point, I mixed up the past tense of a verb, and Emily smiled and gently corrected me. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I realized that this was part of the learning process. Emily wasn't laughing at me. She was helping me improve. This gave me the confidence to keep speaking, even when I wasn't sure if I was saying everything perfectly. After our conversation, I felt proud. I had just spoken with a native English speaker for the first time, and even though it was difficult, I had managed to keep up. I didn't let my mistakes stop me from continuing the conversation. Emily had been kind and patient, and this helped me feel more comfortable. But not every conversation went as smoothly. There were times when I felt completely lost. One afternoon, I visited a busy street market in London. As I walked from stall to stall, looking at the items for sale, I tried to make small talk with the vendors. Most of them spoke quickly, and they didn't always use clear, formal English. They used slang and shortened words, and sometimes I couldn't understand what they were saying at all. I remember one vendor who spoke with a very strong accent. He was selling handmade jewelry, and I wanted to ask about the price of a necklace. I asked, "How much is this?" but his answer came so quickly that I didn't catch a single word. I asked him to repeat, and this time I understood the price, but I still missed the rest of what he was saying. I smiled and nodded politely, but inside I felt frustrated with myself. Why was this so hard? I realized then that speaking with native speakers wasn't just about understanding the words. It was about getting used to the speed of conversation, the informal way people talk, and the cultural differences in how they express themselves. These were things I couldn't learn just by studying textbooks or watching English movies. I had to experience it in real life, and it would take time. Another challenge I faced was joining group conversations. When I was with several people who all spoke English fluently, it was hard to keep up with the fast back and forth. People interrupted each other, laughed, and sometimes spoke over one another. It was difficult to know when to join in, and I often found myself staying quiet because I didn't want to interrupt at the wrong moment or say something that didn't make sense. There was one evening when I was invited to dinner with some new friends I had made in London. They were all native speakers, and the conversation flowed quickly. Everyone was laughing and sharing stories, and I tried my best to follow along. But there were moments when I felt lost, like I was watching a movie in a language I didn't fully understand. I wanted to join in, but by the time I thought of what to say, the conversation had already moved on to a new topic. Despite these challenges, I knew that the only way to get better was to keep trying. I reminded myself that I had come a long way from where I started. Years ago, I couldn't even say hello in English, and now I was having real conversations with native speakers. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was progress. One thing that helped me during this time was meeting people who were patient and understanding. Some native speakers were very kind and would slow down their speech when they saw I was struggling. They didn't mind repeating themselves or explaining a phrase if I didn't understand. This made me feel more confident, and it encouraged me to keep practicing. By the end of my time in London, I had learned an important lesson. Speaking with native English speakers would always be a challenge, but it was a challenge I could face. The more I practiced, the easier it became. I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to keep learning, one conversation at a time. Part 7. Reflecting on my journey. Now, at 30 years old, I look back on my journey of learning English with pride and gratitude. It's been 10 years since I first started, and so much has changed in my life since then. There were many times when I felt like giving up, when the language seemed too difficult and the challenges felt impossible. But I kept going, and today I can say that I've reached a place I once thought was out of my reach. When I was 20, learning English seemed like an enormous task. I had never spoken a word of it, and I couldn't imagine myself being able to have a conversation in a language that felt so foreign to me. I had big dreams of traveling to London, but those dreams seemed distant and unrealistic. I doubted myself many times, but now, looking back, I'm so glad I didn't give up. Learning English was more than just learning a new language. It was a journey of personal growth. It wasn't just about memorizing words or understanding grammar rules. It was about learning patience, persistence, and believing in myself, even when things were difficult. There were so many difficult moments along the way. I remember the early days when even the simplest English words confused me. I struggled with pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. The frustration of not being able to express myself made me doubt if I could ever be good at English. I made many mistakes, and I often felt embarrassed in front of others. But every mistake taught me something valuable. As I grew more determined, I developed habits that helped me improve. I practiced every day, made English part of my life, and found creative ways to learn. Watching movies, listening to music, and talking to others were all ways that helped me immerse myself in the language. I realized that learning a language is a slow process, but it's one that builds on itself over time. The turning point in my journey came when I visited London. It was a dream come true, but it was also a huge test. Speaking with native English speakers was challenging. Their accents were different from what I had learned, and they spoke quickly, using slang and casual expressions. There were times when I couldn't understand what they were saying, and moments when I felt lost in conversations. But each day, I grew more confident and I learned to adapt. By the end of my trip, I was no longer afraid to make mistakes. I realized that speaking imperfectly was part of the process, and the important thing was that I was communicating. Meeting kind and patient people along the way made all the difference. I'll never forget the people in London who took the time to speak slowly, explain things to me, and encourage me to keep going. They helped me understand that learning a language is not just about speaking perfectly, it's about connection. It's about being able to share your thoughts, your feelings, and your experiences with others, even if you don't say everything the right way. As I look back, I'm filled with gratitude for the lessons I've learned along the way. This journey wasn't easy, but it was worth every effort. Learning English opened up so many doors for me. I now have the confidence to travel, meet new people, and experience different cultures. I'm not afraid to challenge myself anymore, and I've realized that I'm capable of more than I ever thought possible. One of the most important things I've learned is that you don't need to be perfect to succeed. For a long time, I believed that if I couldn't speak English fluently, then I wasn't good enough. But over time, I realized that perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. Each small improvement, each new word learned, and each conversation had is a step forward. Even now, I'm still learning, and I know there's always room to improve, but I'm proud of how far I've come. Another thing I've learned is the importance of patience. In the beginning, I wanted to learn English quickly, but I soon found out that language learning doesn't work that way. It's a slow process that requires time and effort. There were moments when I felt like I wasn't improving at all. But when I looked back, I could see how much progress I had made. The key was to stay patient and keep going, even when it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. Looking ahead, I know that my journey with English isn't over. There's always more to learn, more conversations to have, and more experiences to gain. But now, I feel ready for whatever comes next. Learning English has given me more than just a new language. It's given me confidence, resilience, and the belief that I can achieve my goals if I stay dedicated. To anyone who is starting to learn English or any other language, my advice is this: don't give up. It may feel overwhelming at first, and you will face many challenges, but every small step forward is progress. Mistakes are part of the journey, and they will help you grow. Find joy in the little victories, like understanding a new word or having your first conversation in English. Those moments will keep you motivated. Also, don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's from a teacher, a friend, or someone you meet along the way. There are always people who will support you. Language learning is about connection, and the more you practice with others, the easier it will become. As I sit here thinking about my 10-year journey, I feel proud of how far I've come. I once thought that learning English was impossible, but now I know that nothing is impossible if you work hard and believe in yourself. My dream of visiting London came true, but more importantly, I discovered that I'm capable of much more than I ever imagined. I'm grateful for every challenge, every mistake, and every moment of learning because they've shaped me into the person I am today. My journey isn't over, and I'm excited for what the future holds. But no matter where life takes me, I'll always carry with me the lessons I've learned through English: patience, perseverance, and the power of believing in yourself. Hope you have enjoyed the reading.